Welcome back. Today's story filled with drama and unexpected turns. Hit like, subscribe, and let's jump in.
I was sitting at the kitchen table, dressed for work, sipping my coffee and flipping through the morning paper. Sophia was still in the bedroom getting ready. The day seemed like any other workday, nothing unusual stood out. But then, my eyes stopped on a headline in the middle of the front page. Vincent had told me it would happen, and he was right, he always follows through. Men found murdered in garage, it read. The article detailed how Daniel Carter had been killed the previous evening. He was beaten and strangled with a garrote. The paper mentioned he worked at Apex Realty, the same place Sophia worked. The police had no suspects yet, as the investigation had just started. I set the newspaper down on the table where Sophia always sits. As I thought about everything that had led to this moment, a strange sense of calm filled me. I took another sip of coffee just as Sophia walked in. She looked stunning. My wife of 4 years was even more beautiful than the day we met 6 years ago. We didn't greet each other. Instead, she silently poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down. Our marriage had been in a free fall for the past year. A quick glance passed between us. I gave her a faint smile, but she didn't respond. This had been the norm for 3 months since our fight about her longer work hours. She had retreated into herself, and no matter how much I wanted the warmth we once shared, it was clear that part of our relationship was gone. Sophia picked up the paper in one hand, coffee cup in the other hand. Her eyes flashed across the headlines and started down the page. As she took a sip of coffee, all of a sudden she spewed the coffee from her mouth as her eyes seemed to bulge from their sockets. "Oh God, no," she cried out, as her eyes were transfixed on the article about Daniel Carter's murder. I just sat there in silence. There was nothing I needed to say to her about the subject. Sophia looked as if she were about to vomit as she quickly rose from her chair and ran to the bathroom. I took a deep breath, got up from my chair, and placed my coffee cup in the dishwasher. With my briefcase in hand, I went out to the garage and got into my car. I didn't care to ask Sophia if she were all right. It didn't matter to me anymore how she was feeling. Let me do some introductions at this time. My name is James Vitale. All my friends call me MC. I'm 33 years old and a product of Sicilian ancestry in the Italian section of Hartford, Chicago. My youth was mostly spent getting in trouble along with a gang of other young Italian boys. We used to think of ourselves as the junior mafia. I'll skip over most of the other bad stuff we got ourselves into and focus on the one event that had a major change in my wayward direction. Vincent Scalisi and I were closer than two natural brothers. We were the same age and hung out with the same gang of guys. The major difference between Vincent and me was brainpower. I won't say Vincent was dumb or anything like that, it was just the fact he couldn't use his head to keep himself out of trouble with the law. Even though he and I did most of the bad stuff together, he was the one who usually got caught by the police. One night, Vincent and I had broken into a storage warehouse. We were looking for some easy items to rip off and make some cash for ourselves. The security guards must have seen us entering the building through the side window. They were waiting for us as we slipped back out the window with several boxes of MP3 players in our hands. The one guard grabbed Vincent just as I was turning around. The second guard tried to grab me, but I shoved the box into his face. I jumped on the other guard's back and punched him on the side of his head with all my might. He let go of Vincent as I pulled him to the ground. I was shouting to Vincent to get his out of there as fast as he could. Vincent turned and ran off. The second guard recovered and grabbed me from behind. There wasn't much of a struggle after that. The guards had a nice time with me till the cops showed up. When they arrived, they were laughing with the guards as they surveyed my bruised and bloodied body. I was taken to the police station and put in a holding cell until my parents came down to get me released. To make this long story short, I never gave up the name of the other person who was with me in the warehouse. I was given 2 weeks in juvenile detention and put on probation. Vincent called me several times to apologize for skipping out when the guards grabbed me. I told him it was all right because if he had been caught with his prior arrest record, he would have spent a year or more in jail. He vowed that he would make it up to me if it took him the rest of his life. My parents were angry and humiliated by my arrest. My dad thrashed my butt with his leather belt until it almost bled, then they told me they were going to enroll me in St. Mary's Catholic High School because I needed to be straightened out one way or the other. Needless to say, the nuns and priests did a very good job in the discipline department. By my senior year, I had made a change in my lifestyle. One of the priests, who became a mentor for me, encouraged me to take a different path with my life. So it was that I dropped out of the neighborhood gang and finally did well enough that year to get accepted to Providence University. Cutting the long story short, I did well in college and graduated with a degree in human resources. It was easy to find a job with a good company upon graduation. For once, my parents were proud of me. Even though I dated a lot of women while I was in college, I wasn't ready for any long-term commitments. It was 3 years after graduating from college when I met Sophia Lombardi. She was the first woman who made me think twice about ending my bachelorhood. We met at a seminar for HR representatives. After the seminar, I got her phone number and told her I would call her. She seemed quite pleased with that prospect. Sophia was different than any of the other women I had dated. There seemed to be many sides to her personality. At times, Sophia seemed like Joan Wilder in the movie Romancing the Stone. The trait I liked the least was Sophia's stubborn personality. Whenever Sophia took a position about a particular issue, there was no dissuading her from her belief, no matter how wrong that belief might be. Our courtship was an on-again, off-again affair. We never indulged in sexual relations during the first year of our dating. I found out that Sophia had been abandoned as an infant. Her mother left her in a pew in the back of a church and walked out of her life. Her early years were spent in a home for orphan children and then in several foster homes as she became a teenager. I firmly believe it was this lack of having a mother to love and care for her that caused most of Sophia's personality problems. In spite of all her problems, Sophia was the most loving and warm person I had ever known when she was with me during those first years. My parents were not strong supporters of Sophia during our dating years. They always told me I would be sorry if I got too involved with her. I didn't listen to their good advice. Sophia and I were married in a small ceremony at my local church. We both agreed that we would hold off having children until we were financially established, and she would be able to quit her job and be a full-time mother. That fact did not sit well with my parents. Things began to go sour in our marriage during the 3rd year. The company Sophia worked for was bought out by a larger company, and her job was eliminated. She became very depressed by the loss of the job she really liked. We weren't in any financial difficulty, although her salary had been a nice addition to our savings account each month. It took several months before Sophia finally landed a new job. It wasn't a job she particularly wanted. The job was office manager at the Summit Properties. I tried to be overly supportive of Sophia during her unemployment period. Sometimes I felt she resented the fact that I had a job I truly enjoyed and she had to settle for a second-best job. For a long while, she had some serious mood swings, especially during her monthly period. After working at LaSalle for a couple of months, she slowly began to regain her normal, pleasant personality. Things started looking better for both of us. Our sex life, which had suffered badly during Sophia's unemployment period, was also on the rebound. There were times in our bedroom when I felt Sophia was trying very hard to make up for the rough patch by being more aggressive with her lovemaking. I never complained. For about 9 months, our married life was at its best. Sophia became more enthusiastic about her job. She even began a home study course in real estate. I was pleased with the change in her demeanor and the loving wife she was to me. Then came the good news and bad news situation. The good news: I was making a slow but steady progression up the management ladder with my company. I'd been with them for 5 years, and my future looked very promising. Then came a merger with a company based in Nashville, Tennessee, which started a major change in my job responsibilities. The Nashville company was to be assimilated into our corporate structure. As such, I would have the responsibility to train their personnel and to make headcount cuts as I saw necessary. I was really pumped up with my new job responsibilities. The bad news: my new assignments would mean I would be traveling out of town more often and for some longer periods away from home. Sophia was not thrilled with the prospect of me being on the road so much of my time. Even during the longer periods on the road, I managed to be home for the weekends. At first, this seemed to placate Sophia's anger at my being away so much, but, and there always is a but, slowly my coming home for the weekends didn't seem to be enough to make up for the time away from home. Sophia moved into her stubborn mindset in which she claimed I was enjoying being away from home and suddenly hinted that I might have a lover who I spent time with in Nashville. Nothing I could do or say could move her away from this negative thinking. I would call her at work during the day and every night when she was at home. I sent flowers to her at work, and I sent her humorous cards over the internet. Her coolness toward me continued. It had taken the better part of 6 months to complete the staff training in Nashville. My days as a road warrior were coming to an end. In addition, I was given a promotion at corporate headquarters. These were two things which I felt would cause a turnaround in Sophia's attitude toward me. I was wrong. It seemed as soon as I stopped traveling, Sophia started working longer hours at the agency. I tried to question her about the reasons for her working hours. She gave me some sarcastic answer about it being her turn to work for a promotion. She even said that it was time for me to know how it felt to be alone in the evenings. Our sex life was running on empty. 2 weeks ago, Sophia told me that she and several of the people at her agency would be away for the weekend attending a special introduction session with a developer who was beginning construction of high-rise condominiums near the riverside. She said it was imperative for her to get in on the ground floor with this developer. There was no asking me if it would be all right for her to be gone the entire weekend. She was going to go, and that was the end of the discussion. Although I stopped running with the junior mafia when I was in high school, I did keep in touch with several of my closest friends, especially my buddy Vincent. I called him up and asked him if he wanted to see the Giants vs. Ravens game on Saturday. There wasn't any hesitation in his voice. We were going to the game. Vincent always knew how to get the best tickets to the Giants games. I told him Sophia would be away on business on Saturday and Saturday. He then told me to plan to spend the weekend with him and the boys. We could catch up on all the happenings in the old neighborhood. The thought of a weekend away from home and wife sounded really great to me. I didn't bother to tell Sophia of my plans. Wednesday morning had been another chilly event for us around the breakfast table. I briefly asked Sophia if she had a phone number where I could reach her while she was gone. She very coolly told me not to bother to call her while she was gone because she would be with some very influential people, and taking phone calls from her husband would make her feel like I was a father checking up on his teenage daughter. I didn't press the matter any further. In the afternoon, Sophia took her weekender luggage and headed off to the airport in Trenton. Vincent was really glad to see me. It had been over a year since the two of us had gotten together. It seems I was one of the few guys from the junior mafia who had been successful in getting out of the old neighborhood before spending any more time in jail. Vincent would also remind me of the outstanding debt he owed me. Anything you need, MC, you just give Vincent a call, and I'll take care of it for you. Saturday night was spent at the Silver Leopard Lounge on the east side of town. The strip club could easily pass for the Bada Bing Club on The Sopranos. There were a dozen or more young, scantily clad females dancing on stage and lap dancing in the audience. A sweet young thing, she couldn't have been much more than a day older than her 18th birthday, came over and began to wiggle her smooth ass at my face. "Go ahead, MC, she's yours for the night if you want her," Vincent said, squeezing her left hip. "Sorry, Vincent, but you know me, always faithful to my wedding vows. I can't say I'm not seriously tempted, but I do believe in loyalty and fidelity." I looked at the lovely young stripper and just shook my head, no. She pouted for a second and then moved on to try her luck with another male customer. "Damn, you're really serious about this fidelity thing, aren't you, MC?" Vincent said with some disbelief in his voice. "You got that right. Without fidelity, there's nothing. No love, no marriage." The next morning was a typical cold, windy Hartford day, but that didn't matter to the horde of fans who trekked off to the Albany Bills Stadium to see the game between the Giants and the Ravens. There is a bitter rivalry between these two football teams that borders on gang warfare ever since the Giants snatched victory from the jaws of defeat in one of the NFL's most memorable moments with a fortunate bounce. A wide receiver found himself on the end of an unlikely reception that changed the outcome of a fantastic defensive struggle. Neither team has forgotten that legacy. It's a good thing guns are not permitted on the playing field. The Giants weren't having a great year at this point in the season. They were 5 wins and 5 losses. Today would be the biggest game of the season. It was hard-hitting all afternoon on the football field. I was getting hoarse from all the shouting and screaming I'd been doing, but the final score was Giants 21, Ravens 20. The day couldn't have ended on a better note, or so I thought. As much as Vincent wanted me to stick around and get drunk with the rest of the guys, I had to bow out and tell him, another time. Tomorrow would be a hard day at the office, and I knew I didn't need a hangover on top of all the other job pressures. Besides, Sophia was coming home this evening, and I wanted to be there when she got home. Sophia did not come home Saturday night. I left for work Monday morning with some serious doubts in my mind about the latest developments in my marriage. There had been a sense of impending doom whenever I thought deeply about the state of the relationship between Sophia and myself. Sure, there were rough patches in all marriages, but maybe our marriage had decayed into something more than just a rough patch. The workday was as hectic as I thought it would be when I left home in the morning. Several high-level meetings and a harassment lawsuit brought against the company were high on my agenda. It wasn't until 5:30 when I had a chance to sit down and check my emails. There were a dozen emails from the staff along with the latest information on the lawsuit. Near the end of the list of emails was one that seemed to jump off the screen. It was titled, "Who was the last one to know?" As I opened the email, expecting some humorous animated cartoon, I was suddenly faced with a photo of Sophia and another man engaged in a passionate embrace and a lip-locked kiss. At the bottom of the photo was a text message that simply said, "Want to know what happened after this? Click on the next link." A cold chill raised up my spine as I hesitated for a moment, staring at the photo of Sophia kissing another man. Then I clicked on the next link. The screen flashed up another photo. This time, Sophia and the men she was kissing were both nude and standing together in a motel room. Again, at the bottom of the photo was a text message that simply said, "Want to know what happened after this? Click on the next link." My hand was trembling. There was a tightness in my throat and chest as the nude image of my wife burned itself into my brain. There was a part of me that did not want to see the next photo. Still, I knew I had to click on the link. The next photo was the end of my marriage. Sophia was on the bed, on all fours, with the same man from the other two photos. There was an expression of lust and ecstasy on Sophia's face. The only woman I had ever completely loved was nothing but a cheating adulteress. I loved and trusted her with my whole heart, and now she was ripping that heart out of my chest. The text at the bottom of the photo simply said, "Provided by Daniel Carter." My worst nightmare had just been shoved in my face. There was no doubt that Sophia's coldness toward me over these past couple of months was more than just a wife being irate at her husband. Her coldness was akin to the rigor mortis setting into our dying marriage. What follows anger and rage? For me, it was a calm resolve which I had not felt in a very long time. It was the resolve of revenge now settling into my mind. Infidelity and betrayal would not stand in my lifetime. There were two people who would pay dearly for the insult they knowingly heaped upon me. My first thoughts were about the person who sent the incriminating emails to me. There was no name or other indication where the emails were sent from. Questions kept banging around in my head. Why would someone send this email to me? What would they hope to gain from exposing my wife's infidelity? Were they friends of mine or enemies of Sophia? I would have to work out that problem later. I slipped a CD disk into my computer and made a copy of the email along with the 3 photos. Then I deleted the email and followed that with a scrubber program which erases all evidence of the email from my hard drive. As I sat back in my swivel chair trying to make sense of Sophia's betrayal of our marriage, the only explanation I could come up with was to blame it on Sophia's multiple personalities. Yet, if she wanted a divorce, I would have given it to her, and we both could have walked away from this train wreck of a marriage. But now, my revenge would be swift and complete. I would take no prisoners nor give any mercy to either of them. The plan was beginning to gel inside my mind. I left the office building and went around the corner to a pay phone. The number I dialed was an untraceable pay-as-you-go cell phone. "Vincent, I think it's time for me to collect on that debt you owe me." When I got home around 7:30, Sophia was already home and watching TV. She didn't get up and run over to hug and kiss me, she just looked up and simply said, "You're coming home late." "So were you," was my simple reply as I moved into the kitchen area. Nothing else was said between the two of us. I took a beer out of the refrigerator and walked down the hall to the spare room I had converted into an office. I locked the door behind me. When a person is convicted of a capital crime in this country, there is usually one of 2 sentences: the guilty person could receive the death penalty or life in prison. In my revenge plan, there would be 1 death penalty and 1 life in prison sentence. I needed some quiet time to think through the rest of my revenge plan. Vincent would do his part in settling the score with Mr. Daniel Carter. For me, settling the score with Sophia would be a personal effort. I had to put everything in place to make the revenge seem to the police like a simple matter of a wife running away from her loving husband. Over the next couple of days, I continued to send flowers to Sophia's office for everyone to see that her loving husband still cared about her. I made reservations for dinner at a restaurant near her office. I left messages for her to meet me there for dinner, but she never showed up. I told the maitre d' to give our table to someone else, making sure he'd remember me being stood up by my wife. Sophia came home later that evening with no explanation or reason for not showing up for our dinner reservation. The fact was, I simply didn't care for anything she might have said in her defiance. The die had been cast, the wheels of revenge were in motion. Later the next day, a courier came to my office and handed me an envelope marked, "Personal and Confidential." Inside was a single sheet of paper. The heading was in bold print: "Destroy after reading." The first sentence simply said, "Get an airtight alibi for tomorrow night." The second sentence had a name, Carlos Medeiros, and a phone number. I read and reread the phone number until I had it memorized. Then, I fed the sheet of paper through the shredder, gathering up the shredded pieces to discard in various trash cans outside the office building. I beat Sophia home from work that evening, changed clothes, poured a tall glass of bourbon, and sat down to listen to some smooth jazz. The TV would not go on tonight, it was to be my night as king of my castle, and Sophia would have to find some way to entertain herself. There was no confrontation when she got home. She quickly sized up the scene and turned around, walking out the door again. I didn't care where she was going, maybe out to eat, maybe out to meet Daniel Carter again. I could care less. The sand in the hourglass was almost empty for the two of them. I was in bed when Sophia finally came home and slipped quietly into bed alongside me. Silence was the loudest noise to be heard before I fell asleep. Monday evenings are the usual poker night for several of the guys from work. I had joined in the game a couple of times just to keep in touch with the office gossip. It's amazing what bits of information you can pick up when guys loosen up with a few drinks in them. The game was held in the back room of the Rusty Horseshoe Bar. This was going to be my airtight alibi for the rest of the evening. This time, it was me who slipped into bed early in the morning. The clock on my nightstand read 2:30 as I pulled the covers over me. Not a sound or movement from Sophia. It wasn't hard for me to fall asleep, even though I knew what had taken place sometime earlier that evening. Now that Daniel Carter had been delivered his death penalty, it was time to mete out the punishment for the second perpetrator. There didn't need to be any immediate action for the life in prison penalty. The fact that Sophia's punishment would begin soon after I made a phone call gave me a sense of satisfaction and justice. Whatever was in Sophia's twisted personality that made her think she could blatantly disrespect me in the most hideous manner was something for someone else to determine. I no longer felt any compassion toward the woman I once loved with all my heart and soul. The retribution about to fall on her was of her own making. The police interviewed every member of the staff at Apex Realty. They received several interesting but inconsistent statements from members of the staff. Sophia was one of the people they interviewed more than once. Detective Edward Green stopped by the house that evening and questioned me about any knowledge I might have about Daniel Carter. I told the detective I had met Anthony only once, at a Christmas party Navarra held for all its employees and their spouses. Other than that one time, I hadn't seen or spoken to Mr. Harrison. The detective tried to bait me with several questions, inferring that Anthony and Sophia may have been more than just co-workers at the agency. I told him I had complete faith in my wife's faithfulness, and I couldn't think of any reason to doubt her fidelity. He just smiled at me as if he were thinking I was the poor, sorry husband. The funeral for Daniel Carter was held on Monday. That morning, I saw Sophia dressed in her solemn black dress, the same one she wore for my mother's funeral. She didn't ask if I wanted to come with her to Anthony's funeral. Whatever she was thinking concerning Anthony's death, she kept to herself. I'm sure she had a lot to think about, including the murder and her infidelity. On several occasions during the following week, Sophia seemed to want to start a serious discussion about our relationship. My cold shoulder quickly halted any of her attempts. I was beyond any form of reconciliation or kiss and make up. I had my finger on the button and could push it any time I chose to end the charade. 3 weeks after Anthony's murder, the police investigation seemed to peter out. They could find no new leads. Someone hinted that Anthony might have been murdered by a loan shark or a bookie. During those 3 weeks, Sophia's mental state continued to deteriorate. She seemed more absent-minded and confused, little things frightened her. I offered no aid or comfort to her, even though I could see she was having a difficult time. Too bad, I thought to myself, as I watched her slowly falling apart. Finally, on the following Monday, I made the phone call to Carlos. He already had the plan in place and was anxious to get it underway. Sophia had only hours before her new life would begin. Wednesday morning, I was off to work before Sophia was dressed. I didn't want to see her this last time in my house. The sand in the hourglass was empty. A car with 2 men in it was parked across the street from our house. The kidnapping occurred at an intersection where there was a 4-way stop sign. A car in front and one behind blocked any attempt for her to drive away. With the precision of a Delta Force team, 2 men moved into action as soon as the driver's door was opened. A needle was stuck into her arm as the seatbelt was cut away from her body. Sophia was pushed into the passenger seat as one of the men got in behind the steering wheel. The 3 vehicles drove off quickly. The total elapsed time was less than 30 seconds. There were no witnesses. At 11 that morning, in a branch bank located on the north side of town, a woman dressed and made to look exactly like Sophia walked into the bank and handed the teller a withdrawal slip for $40,000 from her joint account. The woman had a driver's license and passport as proof of identity. It took several minutes for the teller to get the withdrawal in the form of a cashier's check. A guard escorted the woman out to her car, noting the license plate as she drove out of the parking lot. The line of passengers at the Delta Airlines ticket counter was not very long as the Sophia lookalike made her way to the smiling clerk behind the counter. She picked up the boarding pass after showing the clerk her photo ID and passport. The flight reservations had been made online the night before. The first leg of the trip was to ORD Airport and then a non-stop on flight number 873 to Santiago. Her flight left Hartford at 5 in the afternoon for ORD Chicago, then at 10:30 that evening, the Delta Airlines plane lifted off the runway, taking the passenger, Sofia Carlucci, on an overnight flight to Argentina. I waited until noon on Saturday before calling the police to report a missing person. Surprisingly, Detective Edward Green was the officer who came to the house to take the report. I told him Sophia had not come home at her usual time, and when I tried calling her cell phone, I received the "not in service" notification. I also called Laura Benton, one of Sophia's close friends at Apex Realty. Megan told me Sophia hadn't come to work on Wednesday and hadn't even called in to report off. Detective Baxter was making some cryptic notes in his notepad. Every now and then, he'd look up at me. He finally began to ask questions about our marriage, whether we were having problems, and if those problems had anything to do with Sophia's disappearance. I told him the same thing I'd said when he questioned me after Daniel Carter's murder: our marriage was fine, and I couldn't think of any reason why Sophia would voluntarily disappear. He then asked me if I had anything to do with foul play involving Sophia. Again, I told him I loved my wife and could not harm her. Lying to the police was an actor's trait I developed at a very early age running with the junior mafia. It still worked well for me. 3 days later, Detective Baxter came to my office during business hours. I guessed he wanted to personally gauge the husband he was dealing with. After being ushered into my office, he sat down and gave me a tight-lipped smile. "Do you have any news concerning Sophia's whereabouts?" I wore my distressed husband expression as I questioned him. "Yes and no, Mr. Carlucci. We did some retracing of Sophia's activities after she left your house on Wednesday morning. Several people claim they saw her having coffee at the Morning Brew on Central Avenue around 10 on Wednesday morning. She then showed up at Hudson Trust Bank around 11. We have a video surveillance tape of her at a cashier's window making a $40,000 withdrawal from your joint savings account." Detective Baxter stopped, assessing the shocked expression on my face. My acting must have passed the test as I asked in amazed shock, "Sophia took $40,000 out of our savings account?" "That's not possible. She didn't tell me anything about wanting to withdraw that kind of money. The facts are pretty clear." The cashier made photocopies of Sophia's driver's license and her passport before making out the cashier's check. "I'm sure that once you see the surveillance tape, you'll be able to identify the person at the cashier's window as your wife, Sophia." Detective Baxter stopped again to gauge my reactions. "I still think there must be some mistake, Detective. Sophia and I talked about everything in our marriage. I'm sure she would have told me if she needed a large sum of money." My bewildered look backed up my words as I stared back at him. "The most disturbing news, Mr. Carlucci, is the fact that your wife purchased airline tickets to Chicago and on to Santiago. We located her car in the long-term parking lot at the airport. Her flight left Hartford Wednesday afternoon at 5 p.m., and then her flight to Santiago left Chicago at 10:30 p.m. We contacted the Argentine police in hopes of locating Sofia, but she seems to have vanished once she arrived in Santiago. Detective Baxter was now staring hard at me, waiting for my reaction. "No, no, this is craziness," I shouted. "Sofia would never do anything like that. I know she loves me, and I love her. Leaving the country is nonsense." I was telling myself to lay it on thick, as I acted out the betrayed husband's script for the detective. I even began to cry right in front of him. There was silence in my office for a minute or so before the detective started talking again. "Do you think this has anything to do with the murder of Daniel Carter?" "What? How do you even dare ask that question? My wife had nothing to do with that murder. You interviewed her yourself, she was never charged with anything connected with that case. We never charged your wife, Mr. Carlucci, but she was high on our suspect list. Several people we interviewed told us they suspected your wife and Mr. Harrison were lovers." His eyes seemed to bore holes into my head. "You've got to be kidding. First, you tell me my wife left the country, and now you're accusing her of being involved with Harrison's murder. You better have more proof than some office gossip to back that up." My eyes were drilling back into his. "We're still working that case, Mr. Carlucci. Now that your wife has fled the country, our suspicions about her involvement in the murder have increased." He paused with a pursed lip, continuing, "There was evidence at the crime scene that indicated the murder was more than just a mob hit for money. The attack on Harrison's body indicated a personal angle to the murder. Harrison was tortured and beaten for several hours before he was strangled." I made a small laughing sound as I responded, "And you think my petite wife did all that? She can hardly open a pickle jar, let alone strangle anyone. Your accusations seem to get more ridiculous every time you open your mouth." I wanted to sound like I was getting angry at Detective Baxter. "Maybe so, Mr. Carlucci, but all the evidence so far points to your wife's involvement. She may have had someone else helping her." He paused again, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And you think I was that other person?" I shot back before he could say another word. "We did consider that possibility, but you had a solid alibi for the time of the murder," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let me get this straight. You come here today, tell me you haven't found my wife, but believe she left the country because she was involved in a murder. You also implied that I was a likely suspect in helping her with that murder." I paused and glared directly at him. "Now, did I get all of that correct, Detective?" He just sat there, staring back, trying to gauge whether my indignation was an act or genuine. "Is there anything else, Detective?" I asked, a hint of scorn in my voice. "If not, this meeting is over." I stood up from behind my desk and moved toward the door, opening it to indicate it was time for him to leave. Detective Baxter got up from his chair and moved slowly to the door. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Carlucci. I'll keep you informed about your wife's disappearance." He didn't extend his hand, and I didn't offer mine. I closed the door after he left and settled back in my swivel chair. I was certain Detective Baxter's visit was intended to extract more information than it was to provide me with any substantial updates about the two cases he was handling. I slowly mulled over every statement he made and every question he asked. It was clear he suspected I might be involved in one or both of the cases. Yet my alibis were solid. I was playing poker on the Monday night Daniel Carter was murdered, and I was in meetings all day last Wednesday when Sofia went missing. It was Saturday morning, 2 weeks after Sofia's disappearance, and I still hadn't heard from either Carlos or Vincent. I had no idea where Sofia was or what was happening to her. Over these past 2 weeks, there were several times when I got the distinct feeling I was being followed on my way to work in the morning or when I returned home at night. My movements were very carefully planned to work, back home, and some grocery shopping on the way, nothing that could look like evasive action or the behavior of someone hiding something. Every other day, I called Detective Baxter to inquire about my missing wife. He had nothing new to report. The Argentine police had found no trace of Sofia after her arrival in Santiago. That afternoon, I called Domino's for a pizza and sat watching college football on TV. When the doorbell rang, the pizza delivery guy was standing there with my hot pizza. I paid him and gave him a couple of bucks for a tip. As I opened the pizza box in the kitchen, I noticed an envelope sitting on top of the pizza. I opened the envelope and pulled out a sheet of paper. Tomorrow morning, dress for church. Go to the 10 Mass at Holy Cross. During communion, slip out the side door on the east side of the church. There will be a dark Ford Crown Victoria waiting outside. Get in. I held the sheet of paper in my hand, knowing this was to be the last meeting with Sophia before Carlos arranged her final destination. He had waited 2 weeks to ensure the cover story of Sophia flying out of the country was well documented and that it was all the evidence the police had to work on. It was an elaborate deception set up by Carlos to send the investigation in the wrong direction, and it established that Sophia was alive when she boarded the plane to Santiago. This way, the police couldn't try to build a circumstantial case of me doing away with Sophia, even though there was no body to be found. The bedroom was pitch black as I lay staring up at the ceiling. This past month and a half had been a living nightmare. After receiving that email, the chain of events reminded me that my ancestral roots would always bring out the dark side of my personality whenever I was disrespected. Whether it was nature or nurture, there was no doubt in my mind where my dark side came from. Holy Cross is a large church, and the 10 Mass is highly attended by hundreds of parishioners. It was easy to get lost in the crowd and check for anyone following me. If the police had a tail on me, they must have waited outside the church. As the throng of people moved to the front of the church for communion, I quickly slipped out the side door. The dark Ford sedan was waiting with its motor running. I got into the back seat as the car pulled into traffic. The trip took about 10 minutes before the big sedan pulled up in front of a large, deserted warehouse. The driver never turned around but just told me to enter the building through the side door. The inside of the warehouse was vast and empty, with light coming from a few office windows near the back. As I approached, Carlos stepped out and walked toward me. This was our first face-to-face meeting. "Hello, MC," he said with a slight smile. "Vincent told me it would be all right to call you MC." His hand was extended, and we shook. "Are you sure you want to see your wife again? These last several weeks haven't been very nice for her," he said, his words a subtle warning that I might not like what I was about to see. "I'm past caring what she looks like or what she's gone through since you took her," I replied, moving toward the open door. "Is she on drugs now?" I asked, pausing at the entrance. "No, but I'm sure she wishes she were. I've kept her clean and very conscious the entire time. She's now a broken woman and well-trained for her new life." We both stepped into the brightly lit room. In the middle of the room sat Sophia, tied to a chair. I walked around her and stood directly in front of her, inches from her body. She looked straight ahead, her gaze fixed over my shoulder, her eyes empty and without their former sparkle. "For the rest of your life, Sophia, you will remember that you brought all this misery down upon yourself," I began slowly, enunciating each word. "I put up with your mood swings and coldness, but I could not tolerate your infidelity. For the disrespect you and your lover heaped upon me, you will now spend the rest of your life paying for your adultery. Anthony has already paid his debt to me." Sophia's face remained stoic, her gaze unwavering. Only a single tear slipped down her cheek. It was the only acknowledgement I received. I took a final look, wanting her to know it was me who had brought both her and her lover to justice. Carlos had assured me that, wherever she was sent, they would take good care of her, as good care as they provided for their most valued cattle. I turned and walked out of the room without looking back. The Ford sedan returned me to St. Mary's just as the 11 Mass was ending. I left the church and drove straight home. There was a tight knot in my gut that needed to be drowned in a tall glass of bourbon. It's been 3 years since the last time I saw Sophia. I have almost forgotten her completely. There are no traces of her in my life anymore. I even sold the house we were living in at the time of her disappearance. Both of Detective Baxter's cases have been moved to the cold case files. I spend more time now with Vincent at the Silver Leopard Lounge. I've sampled the offerings of that sweet young stripper on more than one occasion. Marriage is out of the question for me. My 5 years with Sophia convinced me that women are more trouble than they are worth once you marry them. My parents were right about regretting my involvement with Sophia. Someone once told me that children should listen to their parents' advice. Children rarely do. I later found out that it was Laura Benton who sent me the email. She had been Daniel Carter's lover before he dumped her for Sophia. I never thanked her for the email, nor did I ever find out how she obtained those photos of Anthony and Sophia. I guess she got her revenge at the same time I did. There's something to be said about the wrath of a woman scorned. How far would you go to confront betrayal and rebuild your life? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this gripping story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.